It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. So you want to go tiny, but you might be wondering, where can I park my tiny house? I want to let you know that I have a special unreleased podcast episode of tiny house parking success stories from other tiny houses who were just like you and who have easily managed to find a long-term parking space for their tiny home. Some of them have even found more than one space. So if you want ideas on finding a parking space for your tiny, you can download this episode for free. To get access to it, head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/tiny parking. If you enter your details there, I'll send it straight to your inbox. Now let's intro today's episode. Welcome back to another episode of Tiny House Conversations. So what are electromagnetic fields, or EMFs? Why should you care? How can they affect your health? And how can you minimize exposure in your tiny home? These are just some of the questions we answer in today's episode with my returning guest, the wonderful Amie Skilton. Amie is a naturopath, nutritionist, herbalist, certified mould testing technician, and is currently completing her studies as an EMF testing technician. As a former functional medicine practitioner of 18 years, Amie's view of root cause medicine was forever altered as a result of an environmentally acquired illness. In 2017, after developing Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome, also known as CIRS, she discovered the world of building biology and the various ways in which the built environment has a profound impact on human health. She realized her naturopathic, nutritional, and herbal toolkit were only as useful as her environment was healthy. She's now on a mission to raise awareness of a commonly overlooked but monumentally significant influence on health and well-being. And just like we discussed with Amie in episode number 28, all about mold and the importance of a healthy home environment, today's topic of electromagnetic fields and electromagnetic radiation is also incredibly important when it comes to our physical, mental, emotional, and even spiritual health. And that's exactly why during my own tiny house design earlier this year, one of the main values and principles for me to create a healthy environment was to minimize EMF exposure. And this included looking at things like strategic electrical wiring, light fittings, appliances, the location and layout of each room, and more. So look out for a future episode where I go into detail about all of this. Now, as you'll get to hear today, EMF is a huge topic, and because of the depth and many layers of this area, as well as time constraints, we didn't get to dive into symptoms of electrosensitivity from EMF exposure in this episode. And just like we spoke about with mold, EMF exposure can affect people differently. Now, some of us, like myself, are super aware and sensitive of how it makes us feel. I typically get headaches and buzzing or ringing in the ears, especially if I've been in a place of high exposure of wireless and Wi-Fi and other technology like that. And others may not experience noticeable symptoms. And then some people may not even be aware that certain symptoms or things they're experiencing can be attributed to EMFs. So I want to direct you to a resource that I put in the episode show notes, and it's a patient questionnaire that Amie has provided that covers a list of symptoms that can be related to electrohypersensitivity. Again, just like mold, these symptoms can be similar to other health complaints. But if you're someone who has unexplained symptoms or a health condition that you haven't been able to get to the bottom of, it's good to have the awareness that EMFs could be a contributing factor, especially if you have high levels of exposure in your daily life. And in this conversation, we talk about the different kinds of EMFs, which are most concerning, and the common sources in your tiny home, preventative measures you can take to minimize EMF exposure in your tiny, whether you're building it from scratch or you're already living in it. We also talked about off-grid solar systems and EMFs, the most and least EMF protective building materials, all about Amie's course, EMF Proof Your Home, and so much more. Now, if you're a tiny houser, tiny builder, or you simply care about your health, know this. You have the opportunity here to create a home environment that's supportive of health or one that's detrimental to health, either for yourself or for those you're building tiny homes for. And this episode, our mold prevention podcast, as well as other upcoming building biology and healthy tiny homes episodes, are here as a guide to help educate you with this. Again, just like mold, I feel like this is an area that's not talked about enough in the tiny house space. And it's also worth mentioning that this topic is often met with resistance in mainstream circles and regarded as a non-issue when it comes to our health. But you'll want to tune in for the whole conversation and hear what Amie has to say at the end about the misguided science around all of this. Now, with all that being said, on to this tiny house conversation with Amie. Amie, welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. I'm so excited to have you here again today.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to be back.
So nice to have you back. And Amie, last time you were on the show, we talked all about mold and building biology, and we covered the potential health impacts of mold and what we can consider when it comes to prevention and mold proofing our tiny home environment. And so if you're listening to us at home and you haven't heard this conversation, make sure you go check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes, but you can find that at tinyhouseconversations.com/028. It's mold proof your tiny home. And you'll get to hear a bit more of Amie's story, as well as get a basic understanding and insight into building biology. But Amie, in this episode, we're talking all about EMFs, electromagnetic fields, and electromagnetic radiation. Are you able to start by just clarifying those terms for us? So what is an electromagnetic field?
Oh my goodness, we're just opening with the tough ones, aren't we? So before I sort of dive into that, I just want everyone listening to know this is like a really full-on field to explore. So please note that, I'm going to be using terms and we're exploring concepts that are really foreign, I think, to pretty much every human on the planet, unless you're an electrician or you're an EMF testing technician or working in that sort of area of environmental medicine. Maybe, if you're in the telecommunications industry, some of this will also be familiar to you. So, that being said, I'm going to try and explain it really simply, because if you're not in one of those fields, it's like learning a different language. So an electromagnetic field is a field that actually is made up of two different aspects: the electric field and the magnetic field that's generated when electrons are flowing. And we'll talk about the different categories of electromagnetic fields properly in a minute. But you can have an electric field wherever electricity is present. So even if there's no, let's just take your house, for instance, tiny home or otherwise. If there is power to the house, there is going to be an electric field present around the wiring in the home, even if nothing is switched on and there's no appliances drawing power. It's just present. But as soon as you flick on a light or you turn the fridge on and there is an appliance, whether it's a light bulb, your dishwasher, your fridge, your bedside lamp, drawing current or using the electricity from the wires and pulling it through, a magnetic field is generated around those wires in response to the movement of those electrons. So usually the term EMFs, meaning electromagnetic fields, is just used to describe every category of EMF, but electric fields can absolutely exist without a magnetic field. Just it's a tiny technicality. So I think before I go into the categories of EMFs, just to zoom out a little bit, I want people to know that there are natural EMFs and artificial EMFs as well. So EMFs are not necessarily a bad thing, particularly when we talk about native or naturally produced EMFs. So, for example, I'll give you two examples. We are electrical beings, bioelectrical beings. We actually, through our nervous system, we have our own wiring circuitry, and our cells communicate with electrical impulses, and these can be measured. They are strongest in the brain and the heart, and this is what ECGs and EKGs are looking for when we're measuring brain activity and heart activity. And the magnetic field, the electromagnetic field of our heart actually extends out 10 feet around us, which, if you're any way or shape or form inclined to the spiritual, is really quite a lovely thought that, when you're within 10 foot of someone else, you're actually in their heart field. It's a really beautiful thing. So obviously, those are naturally generated and not harmful to us. They are our own expression of our electrical biology. And by the same token, the earth has its own magnetic field and is generated. Its core is iron, it's moving. And so there is a electromagnetic resonance that the earth produces. And it's a field that we obviously live in, we've evolved into being in, and in fact thrive on. And so, those would be considered native EMFs or natural EMFs. On the other hand, though, we have artificially generated types of EMFs, and they have varying degrees of issues as far as health is concerned with human beings. And much of it, is dependent on how long we're exposed to it, the volume, how close we are to it, and things like that. So don't anyone panic when I start talking about what they are, but they are EMFs that have really been generated out of stuff that, is man-made or human-made. So first of all, we have electric fields, which are created by the presence of electricity or electrons with charge and potential to donate and create, or generate power. So anywhere there's electricity, even if it's not being used, there's an electric field. Now, wherever the electrons are moving or the electricity is being moved along the line, so high voltage power lines are probably a very good example of this outside the home. That's why you don't ever want to live anywhere near those. But also just the circuitry in your home, running your lights and your appliances, also holds these electrons. And as soon as an appliance is being used, the electrons are moving, donating their charge to the appliance and obviously powering it and generating a magnetic field as well. Now, at the lower frequencies, and frequencies, I know that word is often used in spiritual / woo-woo terms. This is really, in this context, a mathematical term. It's a measurable frequency, a bit like when you change the channel on your TV. I mean, does anyone have TVs like that anymore? I'm not sure. I might be dating myself as far as age goes, but back in my day, we had like 2, 3, 4 TV channels, and you'd use the remote to change the channel. And you're simply changing the frequency with which your TV is tuning into or tuning to. Same with a radio. So everyone's got one of those in their car probably, and you change the, I know we've got, what is it, Breeze FM on 99.9. Well, that's literally the frequency that the radio station is broadcasting on. So it's a mathematical, measurable thing. And at the lower frequencies where like electricity is 50 hertz here in Australia, the electric fields and the magnetic fields can be measured separately. However, when we turn the frequency up, at some point, the electric and magnetic fields become indiscernible from one another, collapsing into one another. And this is where we cross over into the wireless radiation frequencies. And wireless radiation is basically any electrical appliance that can run wirelessly. And we're most probably familiar with the communications aspect of that. So again, back in my day, our telephones were plugged into the wall and there was no cordless phone. And then we got cordless phones, and then we got mobile phones, and the connection is accessed via wireless radiation. Bluetooth uses the same, wireless speakers, wireless headphones. I've got a wireless keyboard and mouse, all of that sort of stuff. So they are classified as radio frequencies and are measured with a different instrument because they are higher frequency. On top of that, there's a few other categories of, I guess, EMFs or non-native EMFs. You've got dirty electricity, which relates to electric fields, and we'll dive into what that means, more specifically in a minute. You've also got the light spectrum that also has its own set of frequencies. Every color of light has a specific frequency, and most people know about, UVB, which is part of the blue light spectrum, and its relationship to skin damage and the potential for increasing the likelihood of skin cancers. Light itself is a very interesting subject, and the way our cells respond to it. And so when we think about artificially generated light, whether that's, LED light bulbs in your home, your bedside lamp, a torch, or, the light that comes off your devices, so laptops, tablets, cell phones, that sort of thing. Unnatural, very spiky in the blue range, very strong. Also, we're only meant to be exposed to those types of frequencies at that level during the middle of the day. So that influences all kinds of stuff health-wise. But, with the advent of electricity, we can now have light whenever we want. We're not relying on the sun. And there's obviously advantages to that, but some pretty serious disadvantages health-wise as well. And then lastly, and this is actually not one I talk about a lot, and because it's not something you can typically do much about if you live in a traditional home, but if you live in a tiny home and you can relocate it, it is something that you can absolutely influence in a way regular housing cannot, and that's geopathic stress. Again, that's probably a bit of a deep dive subject we won't be able to go into today, but essentially there are parts of the earth where the electromagnetic field is more beneficial. And we've probably all heard of, special springs in France, is it Lourdes, where healing occurs. But conversely, and I know there's a lot of legends and stories in the Aboriginal culture around where electromagnetic fields of the earth have come together in a way that's actually really not good for us. So, there's an area where people will always cry or have bad dreams, or you're not supposed to live there or spend a lot of time there because it impacts your health. So geopathic stress is another, I guess, element of EMFs. And so herein lies too, you can't make the assumption that all natural EMFs are good for you and all man-made EMFs are bad, because this is one example of where natural EMFs can be harmful. And I just want to give you one example before I sort of round out that summary. There's a field of medicine where pulsed electromagnetic fields are used to stimulate healing. And technically, they are man-made. They're using man-made devices to mimic certain frequencies, often the frequencies of the Earth's natural EMFs. So it's kind of a mimicry of that. But sometimes it's using frequencies outside of that range, but that have been shown to, stimulate faster broken bone healing, or, whatever the case may be. So it's not quite as simple as natural's good, artificial's bad, although it's probably, fairly true. Yeah, as you can see, there's lots of different types of EMFs and things to consider, and some of them more relevant to your home than others, but hence why we're diving in today, aren't we, Lucy?
Exactly. And it is such a big topic, and there's so many great things that you said in there, and I want to just highlight something. You talked about how, we are electromagnetic beings, and it makes sense that these types of, or these EMFs, whether they're natural or they're man-made and non-native, do affect us on some level. So, we can put our bare feet on the earth, and this concept of earthing has become so so much more widely known, and that's us connecting with the electromagnetic field of the earth. And then, you know, we see a lot of that in nature, and then of course the non-native ones for the most part come from the devices that we're talking about. And so, you know, I think about this, and this might be a really oversimplistic way of looking at it, but you know, this analogy of the aeroplane, you know, anyone that's flown on an aeroplane before, you know, you hear that announcement over the plane talking about, please switch off your devices when we're, you know, taking off and when we're landing, because you don't want it to interfere with the functioning of the plane and, you know, the electrical system in there. And I think about that. Would you agree that the same thing applies to us as human beings too?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Humans, we're incredibly inventive. We're incredibly creative, and we've manufactured all kinds of incredible things that make our lives easier or more convenient. But unfortunately, oftentimes it's retrospectively over an extensive period of time that we realize some of these things can be quite harmful. I mean, chemicals in food is another example. There's so many examples. And it is something like, you know, if you've grown up with electricity, or like, you know, generations today growing up cradle to grave with cell phones and wireless baby monitors and things like that. And we just sort of take for granted, just like the food on our supermarket shelves and chemicals, self-care products and pharmacies, it wouldn't be available if it wasn't harmful, and therefore it's harmless. But that couldn't be further from the truth. And whilst I am a huge fan of all the modern conveniences that I have today, I am very mindful of the way I engage with them to get the most benefit, but without putting my health at risk as much as possible. So that's really the intention of today, is not to freak anyone out, but also just to let you know there are ways we can include these things in our tiny homes that don't then have to compromise our health over time. I guess the one thing we didn't touch on was what dirty electricity is. And I do also just want to talk about earthing for a moment before we get into the next bit. Dirty electricity has to do with electric fields. And usually we like to see a nice smooth current moving through the circuits, but you can see high frequency spikes occurring on the line. And if you think about it, it's almost like, it's hard to even really describe the concept, to be honest, but it's a bit like a solar flare from the sun. So the sun's producing, again, it has its own, you know, its own field, but then we see this solar flare where the amount of energy coming out of it sort of spikes like lightning. And dirty electricity is, I guess, a condition. I haven't described that particularly well. So anyone who knows the true definition, it's just too hard to explain if you haven't studied electricity, but it's like you're having these flashes of high frequency fields coming off the line, which are harmful. And, you know, lots of things can trigger it, but common culprits are like light switch dimmers. Anything that interrupts the flow of electricity can do that. And that too can obviously be problematic for people who are sensitive to EMFs. That being said, I think one of the reasons more and more people are becoming sensitive to EMFs is our disconnection from the earth and the natural earthing that would have occurred, that our body desires as a result of, you know, living in apartments, living inside, wearing shoes outside. There's actually a 3-foot layer of electrons blanketing the earth. And it's most dense at sea level, or wherever there's moving water. So even waterfalls and creeks and rivers, have a high concentration. And you have the lowest concentration, obviously, built up areas, and especially when there's high electricity. But all homes, and this is true of a tiny home also, must be earthed. And that is usually done with a copper rod. And, you know, you look at the electricity plugs, and the third, here in Australia anyway, we've got 3 crevices, and the bottom one is the earth. And it's there to actually discharge excess electrons into the earth. And that's literally, we do the same thing when we walk barefoot on the earth. We are discharging positively or positive charges, which it's a bit of an oxymoron. They sound good because they're called positive, but they're not.
Yeah.
They can build up with illness, stress, using electrical devices, and they cause free radical damage to our cells. And when we put our bare foot on the earth, especially when it's damp, we're actually able to discharge or earth those positive charges into the earth. So the earth basically takes away those free radicals and allows us to recharge. It's almost like plugging your cell phone in to be charged. You're plugging yourself into the earth's magnetic field, absorbing those negatively charged ions or electrons, and actually having to recalibrate your own natural magnetic field. So certainly I think with tiny home living, there's more and more of an opportunity. You're living closer to the earth. You're living lighter. I know many people are opting for this lifestyle, if I can call it that, because they appreciate the earth in all of its unique wonders and also want to be outside in it more often. And there's less opportunity in a tiny home to kind of avoid it because there's less distractions and less internal space. Getting the balance right in a home, especially with your tiny home, is part of creating a home that lives in harmony with nature. P.S. You are nature.
Yes.
And supports your health. So I guess maybe that leads to the next thing about what are the common sources inside the home. Do you want me to go there next?
Yeah, that would be great, because I think that's something that it's super important, especially in a smaller space, and it's going to be something that is practical for everyone. So let's go there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so electric fields, when the frequency of the electricity is 50 hertz, can emanate up to 1.2 meters out from the wiring. So basically, any wiring you have in your tiny home is going to harbor or house an electric field. Now, in a tiny home, if you've got wiring on both sides of your home, it might actually, that electric field might take up your entire space. When you are running electrical appliances, which you'll probably be using different things at different times of the day, you'll be generating a magnetic field as well, which could extend out to a similar distance. Basically, the more electricity an appliance uses, the larger the magnetic field it generates. So it's pretty small for lighting. Things like fridges, or if you've got an oven, things like that will create a larger field. So my number one tip, well, number one, it's probably top tip alongside something to do with wireless, which we'll get to, is if you are building a tiny home from scratch, or you have the opportunity to renovate one and you're gutting it, use shielded cabling. And it's a specific type of cabling that the way the wires are manufactured together, it collapses it out and makes it a lot safer. If you have concerns about EMFs and you don't fit into one of those two categories, you could consider replacing the wiring just in the spaces where you sit or sleep or stand for extended periods of time. So maybe in the bedroom area, or if you work from inside your tiny home, like wherever you have your office set up, I'd be looking at that as well. It's quite expensive. Thankfully, if in a tiny home, you don't have a lot of wiring, so it's probably much more affordable to do the whole thing than a conventional size house. But you can also just specifically concentrate it in vulnerable areas. The bedroom would be priority number one, where you sleep at night would be the most important. So anywhere there's wiring, you've got to consider electromagnetic fields. But as I said, the magnetic fields are generated most highly from appliances whilst they're in use. So things like fridges, ovens. A fridge is probably one of the major concerns in a tiny home, because the space is so small, you could be sleeping quite close to it. And it's something that has to be on all the time. Now, the magnetic fields will be highest when the motor's working. So it's not necessarily going to be high all the time, but I would be wary of having a sleeping area above a major appliance like that. Now, if you've got a laundry underneath your bed, probably not such a big deal because you're likely to be doing washing during the day rather than when you're sleeping, and you probably wouldn't be running the dryer at night. And if you are, it's probably going to go off after half an hour. That's if anyone, has either of those things in their home. So, the fridge would be a big one. You don't want to be charging or running appliances near your bed, and you don't sort of want to be, sitting for long periods of time on top of or near major appliances either. So where your, I guess, living area is, if you've got a couch or a lounge area or a dining area where you work from, you want to bear in mind the proximity to, your electrical appliances. So they're probably the main ones. Certainly lighting is something to be mindful of from that point of view, especially with blue light. And you really just don't want to be running any appliances near your bed or near your head. So bedside lamps, I would pull out from the plug at night to avoid the electric fields, and definitely don't charge appliances like your phone near you at night. They'd probably be the really big ones for when it comes to electric and magnetic fields. And obviously with dirty electricity, there are definitely some appliances or things like dimmer switches that can be more problematic. And it's so annoying because, to be able to dim the lights at night is lovely. But if you've got like a dimmer in your bedroom, just know like you don't want to fall asleep with that on, because the dirty electricity being produced from that will be quite major. Moving on from electric and magnetic fields, though, the other really significant one, particularly because of the size of a tiny home, is actually, I'm going to hold off wireless radiation. The one other aspect of EMFs I want to talk about is with solar, actually, because often tiny homes are, if they're not plugged into the grid, that's exactly how they're powering themselves. And so there's some unique challenges around that with where the solar panels go and where the inverter goes. So let's have a chat about that, shall we?
I would love to, because I've got quite a few even personal questions around that too. I've been looking at solar systems for my own home. So let's do that.
Okay, let's talk about that first, and then we'll go on to wireless radiation.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you can, I would have the solar panels away from the bedroom. Usually the bedrooms are sort of elevated in tiny homes. Certainly I'm no connoisseur, but I do love to have a look at designs and, fantasize about what I would do if I had one. And what I've noticed is bedrooms are typically elevated on a mezzanine level and quite close to the roof.
Yeah, like a loft. Yeah.
Like a loft. Yeah, exactly. That is the word I'm looking for. And and often those solar panels are sitting right above the bed area. Now, if you don't sleep during the day up there, or don't spend time up there during the day, this is, less of an issue. Like nothing's ever black and white, but there are going to be EMFs generated from those solar panels collecting the light and converting it, capturing it as direct current. And we'll talk about the inverter in a minute, but there's that. And sometimes there can be a source of dirty electricity too. Now, if they're already there, what I would suggest is you get like a kill switch is probably not the right term, but some sort of switch where you just disconnect them entirely from the grid at night when you're sleeping, so that they're not active in any way, shape or form and able to generate EMF. So it's not a disaster if they are, on top of the bedroom, but you do need to be mindful of that. The other element is the inverter is where it converts the captured power from the sun, which is direct current, into alternating current, which is what all of our appliances run on. Huge amounts of EMFs can be generated from that, or magnetic field specifically. And so, in a traditional house, we would always say put the inverter on the garage or on the laundry, like well away from bedrooms and living areas, especially where people might spend time during the day. So, children's bedrooms or living areas where kids are playing during the day. If you go to work, during the day somewhere else, not such a big deal. But if you are working from your tiny home, it is a big deal. which means it's kind of tricky to figure out where you're going to put that because you don't have a lot of real estate on the outside. You also have aesthetics to consider. You don't want some big, ugly inverter on the front of your house where your living area is. So again, this would be something I would, you probably have to test for. The nice thing about the tiny house movement is people are generally very happy for you to come and check theirs out. Maybe you can take your own meter and measure it, or you can go to expos and, things like that to check out some of the setups. But with that, I would be trying to locate it away from the bedroom, so closer to the ground and away from, the places and spaces you spend a lot of time. So maybe at the back end off the bathroom, if you've got the bathroom under the bedroom. But that is definitely a major issue for health. So yeah, what have you got any questions about that, Lucy?
Yeah, because, one of the things that I see in the tiny house space, especially because of like the limited roof space, depending on the size of the home, is the solar trailer is something that's quite a common option now. And there's also, there's a few different things happening in the tiny space where you can have solar panels on the roof. And then I know that there's a company down in Victoria that does something called a skybox, and that would house like the batteries, the inverter and the generator outside, maybe 20 to 30 meters away from the home. So there's those types of options too. With the solar trailer though, everything is on the trailer. So there'd be no solar panels on the roof. And then all the other equipment is also housed. And yeah, it could be like somewhere from 20 to say 50 meters away from the home. So I'm just wondering from what because some of them also do use Bluetooth and other wireless technologies too. If someone was to go the option of the solar trailer, because you're seeing a lot of solar trailers at tiny homes expos now too. If, for example, they're using wireless technology, but everything is say 20 to 50 meters away from the home, what can you say about that?
Yeah, okay, that's a really interesting thing to ponder.
Yeah.
Distance is always key. That is your number one protection against EMFs is being as far away from them as possible. And what we would say in building biology terms is stay at least 10 meters away from wireless stuff. If it was like, say, for a conventional home, a smart meter, which are compulsory in Victoria for measuring electricity. So, if it's 10 meters or more away from the home, you're probably going to be okay. Couldn't say for sure without actually testing it, but I'd be comfortable with that. And if it's, even further away, like 20 meters or more, that's good. The thing is, though, I'd be curious to know what the purpose of the wireless aspect is. Is it so you can keep an eye on what you're generating via an app on your phone?
Yeah, it's usually the external monitoring so that you can sort of do that either from your laptop when there's an internet connection or from your phone. Usually that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You can shield for wireless, although shielding, is pretty tricky, especially, depending on what other wireless things you have going on. So the thing is, if you are receiving that message from the device, you're definitely being exposed to the wireless radiation. It's only if you couldn't get connection that you're further enough away not to be affected by it. So I don't love that idea, to be honest. It would be nice to think you could switch that on and off as required. Yeah. The other option is you could always use some kind of shielding on the trailer to sort of block the emissions your way, and then you could lower that anytime you wanted to check in. I'm not sure how mission critical it is to keep an eye on that the whole time, but the fact that it's sort of sitting away from the tiny home is definitely a good thing.
Yeah, that's what I figured, because then you don't have, like what you're talking about, the solar panels being on the roof directly above the bedroom, then you kind of don't have that aspect as well.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. And so, that's really good to know, because it is a bit of a minefield as well. And because, you were talking before about modern technology and all these advancements, and everything seems to be going wireless, Bluetooth, on and on and on and on. Because of convenience and, all of the things. And so, like we're even seeing this when it comes to solar trailers and solar systems and, things that go with inside the tiny home. So, you did touch on wireless there. I'm wondering if we can go a bit more into that. As we say, this is how everything is headed, and most people will have something wireless in their home, or maybe they can look for an alternative option if that's available. But yeah, what do you have to say about the wireless fields?
Just going back to sort of to EMFs for a second, just to put it into context, one sort of category of EMFs I haven't touched on is the radiation itself, which is at the upper end of the spectrum. So what I mean by that is nuclear radiation and things like X-rays. So most people understand that although X-rays can be medically necessary at times, it is a harmful level of radiation to be exposed to. And for that reason, they're done, very mindfully. Radiologists will, of course, stand behind a lead-lined wall so that when you get your X-ray, they don't get a dose of radiation as well. And because EMFs, which is what they are, at that end of the spectrum are so powerful and they cause instant DNA damage, all other categories of radiation underneath that are considered harmless. And I think that's where we're running into trouble as a species, because we're now just consuming and loving wireless this, wireless that for the convenience it brings, with absolutely no idea that it is indeed harmful as well. But the difference is you're just getting microwaved slowly. It's like the frog in the pot.
Yeah.
And they're categorized as ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. And so non-ionizing radiation is considered harmless, but that's not the case. It definitely causes single and double-stranded DNA breaks. So it can cause cancer, it can cause DNA damage, it can cause this, multiple ways that it damages cellular biology. It just happens more subtly and slowly over time. Science is slow and logic is fast. And what we now know, let me just give you an example with cell phones. So we now know that if you use your phone next to your head for half an hour a day over 10 years, your risk of a malignant glioma, so glioblastoma or brain tumor, is 200% higher on the side that you use your phone. There's another type of tumor called an acoustic neuroma, and your risk of that is 240% higher on the same side. The risk is even higher with a cordless phone because they generate higher amounts of wireless radiation than even cell phones. And on top of that, wireless headphones can generate 17 times higher amounts of EMFs than a cell phone. And these stats are for cell phones. So wireless technology is incredibly dangerous for our health, but it takes a long time for those biological effects to show up. Sometimes they're quicker, like for example, the damage to sperm. So for male health and male fertility happens quite quickly. And it's very measurable, obviously, as opposed to some of the other things that can happen. But that scares me a lot, how people are just, using wireless everything in their homes. And it's particularly dangerous in a tiny home because your biggest protection is distance and time. And you can't distance yourself from wireless radiation when your home is whatever the average square meterage of a tiny home is. You can't escape it. You certainly can't sit 10 meters from your modem because usually that might be the length of your entire home. So, this is actually, I think, a real opportunity for companies who can actually offer an alternative to protect people who live in tiny homes. So what do we do about that? There's a few things to consider. First of all, most people are using their wireless devices in incredibly dangerous ways, talking with their cell phones to their head, putting their cell phones in their bras or back pocket, having it sit on the desk next to you all day long while you're working, or in your handbag under your arm next to your liver or your heart. while you carry it around, or, on your thigh if you've got yoga pants with a little pocket in there. And, I've done all of these things myself too, by the way. So I'm not pointing fingers. I didn't know better either, but hence why we're having this chat.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got, if you're working from your tiny home or you're somewhere remote and you're traveling, you're going to have a wireless connection to the internet. You will unlikely have an option to plug into the NBN on the street. You might be somewhere where NBN even isn't. And so how do you protect yourself from that? There's probably 1,000 things I could say.
Yeah.
That's why we're going to mention at the end of this chat my course, EMF Proof Your Home. And it sort of goes through all the ways you can reduce your exposure and risk to all of the technology we're lucky to have. But probably the biggest ones are always turn your phone and your wireless devices off at night, and either turn them off completely, put them in flight mode and make sure everything's off, or put them in a Faraday cage or bag, which completely blocks the wireless emissions. It means they won't work, but you do not need Wi-Fi at night when you're sleeping, and you do not need to leave your phone on unless obviously there's something going on, maybe a family emergency or something. That would be step number one. That's going to reduce your exposure by probably around 30% if you sleep for 8 hours a night. So that's a huge win already. Keep your phone in flight mode when you're not using it, unless you have to use it for your job or your business. And then I would say, if you're chatting on it, use text or voice memos over chatting on it. But if you're going to chat on it, use speakerphone or a wired headset, preferably air tubes, so that the wire doesn't come all the way up into your ear canal. With your wireless modem, obviously you have to be able to receive a wireless signal to get internet, but there are modems where you can plug in an Ethernet cable so you can keep the wireless componentry of your laptop off. And if you're lucky enough to set this up from the start of the build, or you renovate, you can just, have an Ethernet port in the wall. Otherwise, you can just run an Ethernet cable, which is what we do here at home, because even though our home actually has smart wiring, which means there's Ethernet ports in every room. I think the rats have gotten into it. And so only one of the ports of the 16 we have even works. So I just run an ugly blue Ethernet cable from, the modem in the garage to the laptop. Now, I can turn the wireless component off the modem because it's plugged into the NBN. You can't do that if that's how you're receiving your signal. But what you can do is opt for a ColorBond roof to reflect the signal away from the interior of your home. Now, that means the connection won't be as strong inside, but if you're using the Ethernet cable, it'll be perfect. It'll be just it'll be the best it possibly can be. So from a performance point of view, it's actually the best way to get the best internet you can access possible, but it will also help to limit the amount of wireless radiation coming into the tiny home. One thing I have to say, though, is it works both ways. So any wireless radiation being produced inside the tiny home will be amplified by metal roof or any other sort of metal building materials in the home. So you can end up creating a microwave inside and literally microwave yourself slowly over time. So this is why the gold standard is to get an EMF testing technician or a building biologist who's trained in this to come and actually take measurements to see where all your sources are coming from, especially because we're even seeing the move to smart appliances, which I hate with a passion. But, if you've bought a fancy new tiny home and they've installed a smart fridge, get that disconnected immediately, or get the wireless component switched off. But a lot of things are wireless that people don't realize either, because it's just become such a part of our life. So, for example, the Bluetooth function on wireless devices can operate independently of the cellular connection and the Wi-Fi connection. So this is how, on planes, you can put your phone in flight mode, but still use your Bluetooth headphones. So you've got to make sure all of that is off and really, really limiting your exposure to it. So I'm sorry, it's sort of not an easy thing to sort of share in a condensed way, but they'd be the biggest things I would suggest. And honestly, the worst thing someone can do, and I have had a client do this, is go to bed with their cell phone.
Yeah.
So, I do personally use mine as an alarm, and I do fall asleep meditating with it sometimes, but it's always in flight mode. The Bluetooth's off, the Wi-Fi is off, and the cellular data is off. And unfortunately, Apple have done an update recently where you used to be able to swipe down or swipe up depending on the model of your phone and just like manually turn those off with the icons, but I've noticed it actually doesn't turn them off at all. It just disconnects them now. So you've got to go into the settings menu and turn it off in there, which is so dangerous and frustrating. But that's probably your biggest exposures from your cell phone. And having it on your body while it's on is a big no-no. And having it as far away from your body as possible when it's on is definitely a good idea. You can actually hardwire the cell phone too, by the way. This is going like a nerd level EMF free. So I appreciate a lot of people aren't going to do this. And clearly you can't do it when you're out and about, but I run my business entirely online, and I probably don't do this during the day because I'm up and down from my desk. But let's say at night, and we all do this. So before you judge me, I know you do it too. But at night, you might jump into bed, or you might, flop down on the couch, and you're going to go into a Instagram scroll hole, or maybe you're online shopping for something and you're going to be on your phone for a while. Rather than holding that near your vital organs for a good couple of hours while it emits wireless radiation, you can put it in flight mode, plug it into the Ethernet cable, and just scroll to your heart's content without exposing yourself to any wireless radiation. So it's a good option if you're going to have a long phone sesh, or maybe you've got a Skype call with your bestie in another country and you're going to chat for the next 90 minutes and have a wine or whatever it is. It's a great way to be able to just safely use your phone when you're going to be on it for a long time.
I know there's this attitude out there that's like, well, we're surrounded by wireless at this point, and all these fields, like, what's the point? What can we do? But I think one of the important things to highlight here is it is, and you talked about distance before too, what you can control in your own environment is the best thing that you can do around to minimize your exposure. Because you can't really control what your neighbor's doing, or if you're in a crowded place or something like that. But these little things add up to big things in our own environment. And you mentioned before ColourBond, and you talked about shielding as well. So I'd love if you're able to just go a bit more into some of those different types of building materials that can be EMF protective, as well as maybe the ones that are most conductive and maybe best to avoid or minimize where possible.
Yes. Oh gosh, this is another minefield really, because the different types of EMFs have different qualities and properties, and therefore, let me give you a good example. So metal is a great conductor of electricity and can contribute to electric fields from, stray currents outside the home as well as what's being produced. But of course, metal framing offers, a more sturdy and lightweight option in tiny homes. Also, a ColourBond roof is the best choice, especially if you're collecting rainwater, for your tiny home, and is excellent for reflecting wireless radiation. So there's no sort of perfect material. It all sort of comes down to how you're going to operate, how mindful you're going to operate inside the property. And I can tell you, if it was me, I don't think you can get around a steel frame anyway because of the weight issues, but I would be doing a ColourBond roof too, much lower maintenance than, shingles and tiles and things like that. And you just don't need as much reinforcing infrastructure to support the weight. But because it is reflective and will amplify wireless frequencies inside the home, and it's a tiny home, so that's, you really can't escape that distance-wise, I would absolutely hardwire my whole tiny home, and I would absolutely do shielded cabling. So there's not a one size fits all. Now, I guess you can take advantage of metal as a shielding device. There's also shielding fabrics. You can get shielding, the plastic contact you get for school books. You can also get like a similar thing for windows. So let's say you had cell phone towers are definitely a major issue for wireless radiation and obviously other people's modems. But the biggest risk you have is from your cell phone inside. So that you've got to sort the inside out before you worry about anything else on the outside. But you can absolutely employ some of those elements if you are going to be somewhat permanently located somewhere that's high in wireless radiation, but you've got to have a professional to do it. You cannot do it yourself because you can absolutely make yourself sick. There's also like shielding paint you can get, but the trouble is let's say there's a cell phone tower like a kilometer away and it's beaming right at you, and then you paint the inside with, shielding paint. You're trapping all of that in there and you'll get sick. I've seen some horrific cases of where it's gone horribly, horribly wrong. So please don't ever do this without professional help because you can actually make it a lot worse. In theory, you could use a metal box or even just a piece of metal to reflect away wireless radiation, say from if you've got a solar truck and that's part of it, or your modem on the tiny home. Of course, if you've got a metal roof, you probably don't need to do that. And there's also a particular type of metal called mu metal, which works to sort of magnetize magnetic fields. So if there's a high magnetic field, like somewhere where you're sleeping, you might be able to employ that as a measure to draw the magnetic field away from your bed. But again, it's very expensive. It's not a foolproof, effective method either. And yeah, often it's just cheaper to relocate the device that's creating the magnetic field. So yeah, this is unfortunately an area where you do have to get professional help because first of all, you need professional meters to measure these things, and they are tens of thousands of dollars. You also need the training on how to use them, again, thousands of dollars. And for a tiny home, to assess a tiny home and get recommendations, because it's such a small space, actually wouldn't be that expensive. I couldn't put a price on it because everyone would charge their own thing, but let's say you invested $500 on a professional to come and test it, give you advice, get it set up, come back and retest. I think that would just be one of the best investments you could ever make in your health. And it is something you want to be aware of, though, because, of course, if you move your home or other people move in next to you, things can change, which is why shielding can become quite dangerous. So, yeah, leave it to the professionals, please.
Yeah, I wondered about that too, of like really trying to not create this like microwave environment in your own home, it's definitely, and I think the moral of the story is that what you're saying with everything today is it is about changing the way that we, I guess, relate to these different devices that we have, how we use them, maybe not bringing them into our home at all. And yes, we can do these little things, but such food for thought, and something that's I'm hearing a lot more about in the tiny house space, especially because if someone's going to be like in a rural environment and maybe they don't necessarily have access to internet so easily, that these satellites and these Starlink things are popping up as an option. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about those.
You have to just treat them like any other like wireless modem. They're going to be emitting wireless radiation that's harmful to you. So you want to be able to turn it off at night when you sleep, so you're not bathing in that wireless radiation all night. But also you want to have it located in an area where if it's on during the day, you can sit as far away from it as possible, which means, opposite ends of the home. Again, a metal roof will help limit the amount of wireless radiation, or likely limit the amount that's coming into the property. But yeah, it is obviously, you've got to be able to maintain a connection with the outside world if you want to, that is. Some people don't. But if you want to, and also if you're, earning a living, you're going to most likely need that. But there's, definitely distance is key, and the amount of time you're exposed to it is key. So let's say, for example, you are a blogger or you ghostwrite or something, maybe you would turn it on. So maybe you'd have it above the bedroom, which, a bit nerve-wracking if you forget to turn it off. But let's say it sits above your bedroom because where you write's at the other end. You turn it on for an hour or so to do your research online, and then you turn it off and you write with it off for the bulk of the day and just turn it back on when you need it. It's more manual. It's annoying. If you can get a sort of a kill switch located more conveniently inside, definitely do that. But for your health, I just think it's in 10 to 20 years of being exposed that we're going to see the brain tumors. We're going to see, there's a specific type of tumor we're seeing in breasts where women are putting their cell phone in their sports bras and going walking. We're seeing like a massive explosion in bowel cancer and people with cell phones in their pockets, and it damages your microbiome, and, that can lead to IBS and all kinds of other stuff. And the connection is not always obvious, especially with some of those more kind of commonplace issues like IBS, which can be caused by other things, of course. So it's tricky because most humans are really just hardwired to avoid pain. So if we don't actually feel pain or an immediate effect, we're not motivated to do something. And it really it's a mindset thing where we have to become more proactive with our health, really, and not wait until something bad happens to make a change.
That seems to be the case quite often, is it's not until like a crisis happens. And maybe we're also thinking about this in a collective sense of everything that's happened in the world in the last couple of years too. But even on an individual level, it's not until things get, really bad that we're like, hang on a second, I need to think about what I'm doing here and how I'm living and what I'm putting in my body and what I'm surrounding myself with in my environment too. And I know that just like we talked about in the last episode with mold, I remember you saying that it's often invisible. And I think about this with EMF too, is just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's not there and doesn't mean that it's not affecting you. And you mentioned a couple of times today about measuring or testing for EMF. So what kinds of things, like if someone wanted to, maybe they're not necessarily wanting to invest in like a building biologist or something, and they're just sort of curious about what could be present in their homes, like what are some of those methods of testing?
So there is actually a great little meter, and I will share the link with you, Lucy, so you can pop it in the show notes, that when I used to travel a lot for work, I would take with me so I could check the hotel rooms and like identify any hidden or not so obvious sources of EMFs, and also like wireless, and position where I was sleeping in the bed to be least exposed. And it does measure the three kind of major EMF fields you'd want to know about: electric fields, magnetic fields, and wireless radiation in particular. Now, I think it's $200. It's like really affordable. Whereas, you look at, I guess, sort of like the next level up for a retail meter would be around $900. And then professional meters are like 10 to 12 grand. It is a single axis meter. And what that means is you've got two different kinds. You've got the single axis and the tri-axis, and they do slightly different things. The single axis, I describe it like a sniffer dog. So you kind of like scanning with it, and it just hones in on one point. And so it allows you to find a problem. So it's a problem finding meter. What it doesn't do is with the tri-axis, it takes measurements from all three planes, so up, down, side to side, and diagonal, and gives you more of an idea of the total body load in that particular space. But what it will allow you to do is go around your tiny home and actually see how far out the electric fields come, see how far out the magnetic fields come. You can also use the wireless setting to see if any of your things are wireless that you didn't know, and kind of see where it is and how high it is. And the really nice thing about it is you don't even have to understand the way that these fields are measured and what's a safe level, and what's an issue, because there's a traffic light system on there. Green is good, yellow is not great, but also not terrible, and red is like highway to the danger zone. And so Yeah, I love it because it's so visible and easy. And, it has an optional like audible alarm. And, when you hear that screaming at you and it's redlining it, it has an impact on you. And then when you change things, you can measure the change. So that would be the one that I would recommend, because it's not like you're sort of throwing away a lot of money on something that you might not use that often, but it is a good way of testing for things. And yeah, that's what I would recommend doing.
Okay, great. Well, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I know for me, the one thing that because I've got mine doesn't measure wireless, but it does have electric and magnetic fields. And one of the things that I was doing with my tiny house is on the land where I'm going to be parking it on, is actually using it to see if there are any like underground electrical wiring and different pockets of electrical fields and magnetic fields around. And I think that's something that could be really useful for people too, if they're thinking about where they're going to park their tiny home in general.
Definitely, because stray currents can come up metal pipes. So if you've got plumbing to the site or nearby, that's another way you can use it for sure.
Yeah, great. And Amie, I know you've got your EMF Proof Your Home course. So do you want to let us know more about that?
Yes. Okay. So EMF Proof Your Home is a self-paced course that I created to help people understand all the different types of EMFs, teach them where you'll find them in your home, whether that's a tiny home or a conventional home, and provide a checklist of all the practical things you can do to lower your exposure to these things. And, not everything's going to apply in every situation, but it's about taking responsibility for what you can control and doing what you feel you can manage. And every little bit adds up, right? So it's not about getting an electroclimate in your home that's, absent entirely. But knowing the health effects of these various types of EMFs, and we'll touch on the research, I guess, to finish up in a second, but it's really very practical and solution orientated. And if you feel a bit overwhelmed by everything we've talked about today, it's also broken up into little sections. So you get a section a week to kind of work through. So you can just do a little bit at a time, and you get lifetime access to the course as well. So, as new information comes to light and it gets an upgrade, you'll get access. And, your circumstances might change and you'll have a new home of some description to look after again. So I'm really proud of it mostly because it's raising awareness of where non-native EMFs are harmful to our health and what we can do about it. P.S. didn't mention, but in the last 100 years, our exposure to artificial EMFs has increased a quintillion-fold. So for anyone thinking this isn't a big deal, that's 18 zeros, by the way. If you're trying to figure out like what a quintillion looks like, write down the number 1 and then 18 zeros.
Wow.
The exponential exposure, especially with the coming of 5G, 6G, the Internet of Things, is terrifying. And most people aren't the least bit worried because they have no idea how bad things already are and how bad it could get. And I feel like, at least if you know this and you know how to control your immediate environment, that's 90% of the way there anyway. But in addition to that, it's really just a very practical or practically applied set of recommendations that allow you to just really make a low EMF home and preserve your health as much as humanly possible.
Such an important offering that you have, especially in a time like this where, like you're saying, there's 5G now, but they're already talking about 6G, and then what are the next higher levels of frequencies, and everything's going wireless. And because it is such a minefield, and as we haven't even scratched the surface today, we could go even deeper and deeper, but it is such a minefield for especially if it's something that's sort of new and people are diving into this now. There's so many moving parts. I mean, I think I said the same thing at the end of the mold episode, but it is true. There's so many moving parts, and there's so many. I mean, we talked about the different types of fields today, and then the different sources that they come from. but just being able to break things down, step by step for people, and know that, and I think I said this to you offline before we started recording, that this is something for myself that I've built up, and I'm sure you've done the same thing for yourself too. You build it up over a long period of time. It's not about doing everything all at once now, because you'll get too overwhelming, but just like one little change. And then once you've got that, the next one, and it sounds like your course is going to be able to, help hold people's hand and walk them through those little changes. So what's the link, or where's the best place that they can check that out if they want to?
If they would like to check out the course, we'll pop the link in the show notes, but it sits at amieskilton.com, and that's Amie spelled A-M-I-E. Thanks, Mum. amieskilton.com /EMF proof. So you can check out all of the details there. And inside is also links to the research on the health effects of EMFs. And I think I just want to maybe wrap up our chat with that, because again, and this is probably, a sensitive subject, but like a lot of other big money industries, what you see reflected in communications on mainstream media and social media about, I'd be called a member of the tinfoil hat brigade, I'm sure.
Me too.
Proud of it. But basically, that sort of marketing messaging is designed to protect and preserve commercial interests only. And it's very much like pharmaceutical industry. If you look at, first of all, you've got to know where to look and how to read the research, but I'll also drop the link for the author database, and they catalog everything, including studies that show no harmful effects and beneficial effects. But there's essentially 7,500 papers and growing of harmful biological effects, and there's about 2,500 saying, it's not a problem, and 2,499 of them are funded by telecommunications companies. And it's very much like pharmaceutical drugs. You look at who's paying for the research to be done. You could literally design a study to get whatever outcome you want. And even if you don't get the outcome you want, you can manipulate the data to look a certain way. And we see that with drugs all the time. And the same thing happens in this space. So it is really tricky. Government makes a lot of money off selling the bandwidths, and they're probably concerned if people knew the truth, they'd throw their cell phones out. Not going to happen. I'm not giving mine up. But what I want is for people to actually respect and understand and appreciate the technology we have, and really know how to use it in a way that doesn't harm their health. And this conversation is the start of that.
Yeah, I'm glad you finished with that, because with so many other things coming to light, especially in the last couple of years, that's just another piece of the puzzle where you do have to follow the money, I suppose. It is a real thing that industry and big companies and big phone companies and all the other ones, it is a thing. And I know, you can look at the food industry as well, and just every other industry really, is you can, as you say, you can design a study to have an outcome for whatever it is you want. And if you've got enough money, there are ways to influence the outcomes. So yeah, definitely food for thought. And if anyone wants to maybe come and check you out on social media as well, what's the best place that they can do that?
So my favorite place to hang out online is Instagram. So you can find me at that Naturopath. And I'm also online. My online home is whatthenaturopathsaid.com.
Beautiful. I'll put all of those in the show notes at tinyhouseconversations.com /032 for this episode. And Amie, again, I feel like I could talk to you about these kinds of topics for hours. Thank you so much for your time today and for all this generous sharing. I really appreciate it. And again, I think it's going to be helpful for a lot of people, because just like the topic of mold, this is not talked about enough in the tiny house space, I think, as well as in general, talking tiny houses. I think, more builders need to know about this, more tiny houses need to know about this, and actually everyone needs to know about this. So thank you so much for being the one to share it with us.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Lucy.
And if you're listening to us at home, thank you so much, as always, for being here. Make sure you go check out what Amie's doing, and I'll put all the links in the episode show notes. And stay tuned every Thursday for new episodes of Tiny House Conversations. I'll see you next week. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.